Hey everyone! In today's video we will be unearthing the dark secrets of real witches from history. From notorious trials that sparked mass hysteria, to eerie rituals and evil practices. Perhaps some of these witches were misunderstood, but at times, something far more sinister was occurring in the shadows. So, join me as we explore all of this and more. For our first story, we are heading back to the start of the infamous Salem witch trials. In the Puritan town of Salem, Massachusetts, in 1692, the local Reverend Samuel Parris became increasingly concerned for the welfare of his 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece Abigail. The two girls had begun to behave frantically, screaming in pain, claiming to be pinched by unseen forces, and having fits. Samuel Parris desperately sought out the help of a local doctor, William Griggs. Griggs examined the girls, but was unable to diagnose any known medical condition. So he claimed that the only reason the girls could be suffering was because they had been possessed by the devil. To make matters worse, two of the friends of the Parris girls, Anne Putton and Elizabeth Hubbard, also began complaining of mysterious visions and hallucinations. Panic swept through the colony of Salem, and the town's leaders declared that Salem was under attack by supernatural forces. The hysteria that consumed Salem would eventually lead to the most infamous witch hunt in American history. The witch trials that took place resulted in almost 200 people being accused of witchcraft, with 19 people being killed, and 5 others dying in custody. Despite so many people being accused, most remain a mystery, but a lady named Tituba would be at the centre of the hysteria, and remembered as the first woman to be accused of witchcraft during the trials. The story of Tituba's origins remain unclear, but some scholars believe that she was more than likely from the Arawak tribe of Venezuela before being captured and taken to Barbados to be sold as a slave. Despite the theory of some scholars, however, some historians also believe she may have been a native of Barbados. The main story of how Tituba reached Barbados begins with an English seafarer. In July of 1674, Captain Peter Roth of Kent, England, set sail from Barbados on his vessel, the Sanoy, destined for the northeast coast of South America. His intentions were to kidnap some American Indians and sell them into slavery, as well as trade with the more friendly tribes. Captain Roth arrived at the Amacura River and began to look out for any potential targets. While sailing up the river, he met with groups of men travelling on canoes, who were told to board the ship to trade. Those men were not taken as captives, as Roth claimed that women slaves were preferred, and some tribes were protected by the English crown. Eventually, Roth came across 8 women and 2 children who wished to trade goods. Yet Roth had another purpose, and hatched a plan to kidnap the group, who also boarded his ship to trade. The master of the vessel, William Price, and his crew managed to capture the women, and they set sail back down the Amacura River and out onto the Atlantic on a return voyage to Barbados. Though historians agree that this is more likely to have occurred, there is the possibility of Tituba descending from a group of Arawaks that had been taken to Barbados to teach settlers how to grow crops. However, one major discrepancy in the story is that by the 1650s, most of the Arawaks were either dead or had returned to the mainland. It's believed that there were no Arawaks remaining on the island. Despite the mysteries of her origins, Tituba was eventually bought by Samuel Parris, a sugar plantation owner in Barbados. Parris studied theology at Harvard, while his father had run the plantation, but he left without completing his degree. After his father's death in 1678, he moved back to Barbados, but the plantation had been suffering under the decreasing sugar prices, as well as a hurricane wrecking the warehouses. So, he decided to leave the string of bad luck behind him and moved with his wife, Elizabeth Elridge, and 3 children to Salem, where he was accepted in becoming the local reverend. At this time, Tituba would have gone with them to Salem as a domestic slave. Amerindian slave women were not usually put to work in the fields, but were regarded as good cooks, and so were primarily tasked with domestic work in the kitchen or within a household. Amerindian slaves remained small in number in comparison to African slaves, so Roth's adventures through South America may have been in the hopes of increasing the number of domestic slaves. One of these may have been Tituba. After arriving in Massachusetts in 1680, the family settled down in Salem after finally settling a wage dispute. Some of the villagers were happy to accommodate the Parrises with hefty contributions, allowing the family to receive a decent wage, while other inhabitants of the town weren't as keen to contribute. Salem was a town embroiled in bitter disputes. The Putnam clan and the town family were engaged in disputes of a right to woodland, as they had both begun to cut down trees on each other's land, leading to a conflict which lasted over 50 years. Both the previous reverends, George Burroughs and James Bailey, had been forced out of their jobs when the villagers refused to pay their salaries. Despite this, the Parrises managed to settle in, and in particular, Tituba and Betty Parris got along well. The Parrises were often away from home on parish business, so the children spent most of their time with Tituba, who entertained them with stories about traditional voodoo practices in Barbados. After Betty and Abigail had begun to experience strange behaviour, Samuel pressed the girls to tell them who was responsible for practicing witchcraft. Despite her relationship with the young girls, they were quick to accuse Tituba. She was implicated in the practicing of voodoo and of allowing the girls to participate in the baking of a so-called witch cake. It was the Parris' neighbour, Mary Sibley, who allegedly instructed Tituba to bake a witch cake and feed it to a dog, in the hopes that it would reveal whoever was bewitching the young girls in Salem. At the time of the witch trials, Tituba was accused of practicing witchcraft on the 2 girls, but denied all charges against her. She was arrested and thrown in jail alongside 2 other women, the elderly Sarah Osborne and a beggar named Sarah Good. Although initially Tituba staunchly denied dabbling in witchcraft, under the questioning of Magistrate John Hathorne, she made a startling confession. Tituba claimed she hadn't caused the 2 young girls any harm, but had made a pact with the devil. John Hathorne asked, "Did you never see the devil?" To which Tituba confessed, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him." The townspeople gathered in the courtroom to hear the confession of Tituba. The villagers were completely captivated by the tale of the demonic entities at work in Salem. Tituba gave descriptions of a variety of demonic characters, animal accomplices, and other evil spirits that had arrived in Salem, eager to destroy the Puritan community. She also accused others of witchcraft in her confession, claiming that Sharon Osborne possessed a creature with the head of a woman, 2 legs, and wings. Supposedly, she even mentioned riding broomsticks to different places. Tituba spoke of a tall white-haired man in a dark coat that had appeared to her and ordered her to hurt the children. If she didn't comply with his request, he told her she would die. What made Tituba confess to her supposed covenant with the devil isn't clear, but scholars believe she was the perfect scapegoat for the Parris household. It's widely assumed that she was forced into making the confession, which would have given her owner, Samuel Parris, a plausible explanation for the girls' behaviour, especially to the villagers, who would have been concerned about the apparent fortune-telling techniques the 2 young girls had started to practice before their demise in health. As she was enslaved, Tituba would have been obliged to obey her master, and so would have had no choice but to follow the orders of Samuel Parris. She was treated harshly by Parris for refusing to own up to practicing witchcraft, and was beaten for allowing the girls to take part in fortune-telling practices. But it's entirely possible that she was also attempting to appeal to the Puritans' way of forgiveness by owning up to her supposed pact with Satan. She had already been imprisoned, so probably thought a confession was her best way of escape. Tituba relied on the strict Puritan belief that if you confessed and repented your sins, you could still be saved. In her testimony, Tituba claimed that women have a predisposition towards sin, and because she was a slave, she also had an obligation towards servitude. Also implicated in the charges were Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, who along with Tituba appeared before the court. Both women denied the charges. Despite their claim to innocence, Good and Osborne were condemned. Osborne died in jail, and on July 19, 1692, Sarah Good was one of those hanged at Gallows Hill. Tituba knew the severity of the accusations, and she would have needed a miracle of her own if she was going to survive. Tituba confessed, repented, and declared her love for Samuel Parris's daughter, Betty. The public began to warm to Tituba, and the jury began to change their sentiment toward her confession, which she eventually rescinded after claiming it was made under the harsh treatment of Parris. She was spared in her trial, as the Puritan community couldn't justify executing her after her repentance. Her ability to win over the villagers was a triumph. On May 9, 1693, the grand jury refused to indict Tituba due to a lack of evidence, but she would still end up serving a 13-month prison sentence in an overcrowded Boston prison, as Samuel Parris refused to pay her bail due to Tituba rescinding her confession. After her trial, she was sold to an unnamed person for the price of the debt. Tituba then disappears from historical records. She has been immortalized in numerous fictional accounts and has become one of the most intriguing characters in the Salem witch trials. Although not much of her life was documented, her legacy lives on. Next, we are going to the early 19th century to look into the life and legend of the White Witch of Rolls Hall. The woman who later became known as the White Witch of Rolls Hall was born as Annie Patterson somewhere in Britain in 1802 to an English mother and an Irish father. Her exact birthplace is unclear, and some accounts suggest she was born in Scotland. Annie's family soon moved to Haiti when Annie was around 9 or 10 years of age. At that time, a part of the island of Hispaniola, which had experienced extreme political and social unrest in the 1790s and 1800s, largely owing to its origins as a French sugar colony, which could not be controlled from Paris during the French Revolutionary Wars and Napoleonic Wars which followed. Shortly after the arrival of the family in Haiti, Annie's parents died from yellow fever, a tropical disease with symptoms similar to jaundice. Thereafter, Annie was allegedly raised by her nanny, who was a voodoo priestess at a time when Haiti was a central home of voodoo. However, just over 6 or 7 years later, Annie was again struck by loss when this nanny died, leaving her essentially fully orphaned in a Caribbean world, which was so different to Britain, where she had spent her first 10 years. It was in these circumstances that Annie Patterson set off for Jamaica. Unlike Haiti, which was originally settled as a French colony, Jamaica had been under English control since the mid-17th century, when the Cromwellian government conquered it from the Spanish. As such, Patterson, as an English-born woman, might have decided that she would be more at home here. Jamaica, like elsewhere in the Caribbean, was settled along slave plantation lines, generally with a small minority of European colonists who ran large-scale plantations producing cash crops, principally sugar, and based on the labour of large numbers of enslaved people. Yet at the time, Annie would have had no clue that her move to Jamaica in the long run would lead to the creation of the infamous tale of the White Witch, and it was all intimately associated with the manor of Rose Hall. The manor of Rose Hall had been built during the 1770s by a senior member of the colonial community in Jamaica, John Palmer, at the same time that Jamaica was flooding in colonial money and many rich and lavish plantation houses were emerging. It was erected on the site of an earlier colonial residence, one which had previously been known as Rose Hall, after the mistress of the household, Rosa Kelly. The house is a vast estate and is considered by many observers to be the finest plantation or colonial manor house ever built on the island of Jamaica during the early modern period. Rosa Kelly subsequently became John Palmer's wife, the latest of multiple nuptials for both Rosa and John. It should be noted here that there is no suspicion that either John Palmer or Rosa Kelly were murdered, an important point given the later allegations against Annie Palmer. Rosa herself died in 1790, and John Palmer passed away 7 years later in 1797. A further wife, which John had taken in the early 1790s after Rosa's death, subsequently returned to England and lived a long life there until the mid-1840s. Thus, these individuals had died or left Jamaica years, even decades before Annie Patterson ever arrived there. The wider Palmer family were in general back in England and lived a comfortable life there on the back of the profits gleaned from their Jamaican plantation. However, one member of the dynasty, John Rose Palmer, a nephew of John Palmer Sr. and Rosa, elected to live on and manage the estate in Jamaica, following their deaths in the 1790s. He was still there in 1818 when Annie Patterson arrived to the island. They soon met and married. Thus, Annie Patterson became Annie Palmer and became the mistress of Rose Hall, a large plantation estate. And with this, the myth of the White Witch would soon follow. According to legend, Annie is believed to have employed magic from the very early beginnings of her arrival in Jamaica. For instance, it is suggested, according to certain myths about her life, that when she met John Palmer and realized that he was the owner of a large plantation estate, she cast a spell on him in order to entrance him into marrying her. So, the first part of the myth of the White Witch is that Annie Patterson became the mistress of Rose Hall and Annie Palmer by invoking magic against John Palmer. Then, having married John and inveigled her way to a position of prominence at Rose Hall, Annie is believed to have quickly conspired to dispense with her new husband entirely in order to obtain sole control over Rose Hall. Shortly after they were wed and had settled down to married life at the manor, Annie is believed to have poisoned John and killed him in order to obtain control of the plantation. Other spurious accounts suggest she poisoned extended members of the Palmer family as well at this time, many of whom, as we previously saw, had been deceased due to natural causes for years, in some cases as much as 20 or more years. Not long after this, it is believed that Annie married again, this time to an English planter whom it is rumoured that she also killed in quick succession, this time by stabbing him to death. A third marriage is believed to have developed and ended similarly in the months or years that followed. On this occasion, the White Witch is alleged to have used one of the enslaved men on the plantation to strangle this most recent husband to death. In both instances, it is supposed in different accounts of her life that Annie profited from killing these subsequent husbands, in the same way she had become the sole mistress of Rose Hall by murdering John Palmer. In the years after she took over, Annie is alleged to have ruled the plantation in a heavy-handed and indeed sadistic fashion. She was said to have whipped the enslaved people there and tortured them, even putting some to death. Moreover, elements of her past years in Haiti were incorporated into the story. Some accounts, for instance, suggesting that Annie engaged in voodoo practices, which were, both then as now, intimately associated with Haiti. Perhaps most graphically, Annie was said to have had the basement of Rose Hall refurbished and turned into a dungeon of sorts, where she would carry out her acts of torture. Most savagely, it was even rumoured that the White Witch had murdered the children of some of the enslaved plantation workers at Rose Hall, and then harvested their bones for use as a species of compound in her black magic spells. While there are many myths and varying stories about Annie's behaviour, most agree that the White Witch finally met her demise when she ended up in a conflict with a former enslaved man named Taku, whom she had previously taken as a lover. Palmer is said to have murdered one of Taku's relatives, and he is then supposed to have killed her in retaliation, using a mix of black magic and physical force. Another version of events is less dramatic, and simply asserts that Taku became angered with the White Witch as a result of her having taken another lover from amongst the other enslaved workers, and consequently, Taku simply strangled her in her sleep. A third version of the story states that it was Taku's son-in-law who was involved in her murder. But the tale doesn't end there. Various versions claim that in the months and years following her death, Annie's spirit continued to roam the manor and grounds of Rose Hall, terrorizing the slaves and servants whom she now sought to punish for having failed to protect her in life. This was despite the fact that the enslaved plantation workers had conducted a voodoo ritual to try and ensure that she could not strike at them from beyond the grave. Such tales persisted for decades, and implied that, for years after her death, the spirit of Palmer continued to roam and haunt the manor of Rose Hall on Jamaica. Thus, the killer White Witch was now a ghostly entity, possibly seeking revenge even after death. So, could any of this myth of the White Witch have any basis at all in reality? The answer is largely no. In reality, Annie Palmer and John Palmer left Rose Hall shortly after they were married, around 1820. Despite the grandeur of the manor, the estate had run into massive financial problems in the early 19th century, as slavery was gradually prohibited and then banned entirely throughout Britain's colonial possessions. As this occurred, John Palmer eventually ended up passing ownership of the manor of Rose Hall to his creditors, and he and Annie left the estate entirely. Not a lot is known about what they did thereafter, while the manor of Rose Hall was actually abandoned for about 130 years, until it was re-edified and reoccupied during the mid-20th century. This raises the question as to why the myth of the White Witch emerged to begin with, and there is a relatively direct answer to this question. In 1868, a story was published about the first owner of Rose Hall, Rose Palmer, who lived decades before Annie Palmer ever arrived on the scene. Like the myth of Annie, Rose Palmer had multiple husbands and had been largely in charge of Rose Hall. Over the years that followed, additional details were added which subsequently furthered the myth of the White Witch. Most significant in this regard was a book on local Jamaican history which was published in 1911, and a novel in 1929 which complemented the myth of the White Witch. In the latter instance, a century had passed since the time of Palmer's supposed misdeeds, and there was nobody left around to argue against these untruths. Thus, the book, which was published in 1929 as a work of fiction, and was not meant to be interpreted as a piece of accurate historical reportage, entered into the record as a piece of pseudo-history. Nevertheless, while the true story of Annie Palmer is well known today, many people in Jamaica still consider Rose Hall to be a haunted house, and there are numerous stories of the manor house being haunted by a figure dressed in green velvet, early 19th century clothing, haunting the lands of the manor and plantation. In other versions, a woman in white wanders around the house, while further accounts still record how screams can regularly be heard from Rose Hall at night, especially in the basement, which Annie is said to have converted into a dungeon, but which today is a gift shop at what has become a tourist site. Thus, while the myth of Annie Palmer and the White Witch of Rose Hall have been dismissed as nothing more than a tale, residual elements of the Jamaican horror story continue to be believed today, and it would seem with good reason. Now, let us go to a small town in the state of Mississippi, where a local witch is said to have caused much destruction. Who exactly the Witch of Yazoo was, or where she came from, is unknown. Apparently, the old, ugly woman was nasty, and because of this, people stayed away from her secluded home on the swamps near Yazoo City. Yet, it should be stated that the town known as Yazoo City was a relatively new settlement. Located in Yazoo County, Mississippi, it was founded in the 1820s when a Choctaw chief called Greenwood LaFleur sold the land to 5 proprietors who hoped to develop the area into a port town. Originally called Manchester, the men surveyed the land and planned the creation of the future town. Even before anybody lived there, the streets were named and the whole community was divided into numbered lots. Following this, the men started putting adverts in local newspapers. In the ads, it was stated that the lots of the future town of Manchester were to go on sale the 22nd of February, 1830. Around this time, many potential buyers came to the future settlement, most arriving by chartered steamboat. After just 2 days, the best downtown real estate had already been purchased. Just 4 years later, the town's construction was underway. All the lots had finally been sold, and it wasn't long until the town had hundreds of homes, various businesses, a bank, and even 2 hotels. By 1840, the small town of Manchester was shipping 25,000 bales of cotton per annum and had over 1,000 residents. The following year, Manchester's name was changed to Yazoo City, in tribute to the Yazoo River, which was essential for the town's existence. As time passed, the so-called city continued to grow in size and population. It even became the county seat for the Mississippi legislature, and years later, a beautiful new courthouse was erected. It may have been around this time that this mysterious lady moved to the area near the town, as prior to this, there was little infrastructure and surviving would have been seriously hard. Moreover, due to the swampy area, mosquitoes were a huge problem, causing many of the townsfolk to die from yellow fever. Apparently, locals didn't know much about the witch. It's said that she had an evil nature, which made the townsfolk not only fear her, but also hate her. Supposedly, they stayed as far away as possible, to such an extent that they didn't even know her name. By the 1880s, cotton, which was the town's main export, continued to increase, with hundreds of men working in the fields. As the town slowly expanded, a railway was introduced to further facilitate their connection to the rest of the state and the country. However, there was also a considerable number of people who lived off fishing in the nearby river. Yet, during the 1880s, many fishermen who went out on their boats never returned. Local rumors stated that the witch lured these men into her house, providing them with shelter during stormy nights. However, the Witch of Yazoo was no good Samaritan. While pretending to aid these men, she would poison them with arsenic and wait for them to die. Following this, the witch is said to have buried the bodies in some woods nearby. Due to the density of the forest and the remote location, she believed that no one would ever find out about her evil ways. As time passed, the townsfolk began to suspect the mysterious witch for being responsible for these disappearances, but of course, there was no evidence, so nothing could be proved. However, this all changed in the autumn of 1884. It was around dusk when a lad called Joe Bob Duggett was on his raft passing by the swampy part of the river, which just so happened to be near the witch's home. While drifting through this area, Joe heard an awful sounding scream coming from the witch's house. Intrigued, he decided to get a closer look, so he made his way to the riverbank, tied up his raft, and ran to the house. Once there, Joe peeked through a window, but nothing could prepare him for what he saw. Before Joe's eyes were two lifeless men laying in the living room. He also spotted an old woman slightly further away who was looking up towards the ceiling, singing strange, frightening chants while randomly waving her arms in circles. Shocked and fearing for his life, Joe immediately ran to his raft, untied it, and made his way back to Yazoo City. Once in town, he found the sheriff and informed him of the terrible things he had seen. The sheriff, accompanied by Joe and his men, made their way as fast as they could to the witch's home. Once there, the group burst through the front door, but the two men that Joe claimed to have seen had seemingly vanished along with the old woman. Of course, this made the sheriff question if Joe had been telling the truth, but after searching the house attic, he was more than convinced of the old lady's evil ways. In the attic, the group found many malnourished cats huddled together, surrounded by fish bones that covered the floor. It was obvious that these cats had been badly mistreated, yet what horrified those present most were the two skeletons dangling from a dusty support beam. Just a few seconds was enough to terrify the sheriff and his deputies, who then closed the door shut. During this time period, around 10 cats rushed out, escaping the attic. The search party believed that the woman had fled, but all of a sudden, she gave herself away when a deputy heard somebody rustling in the leaves next to the house. From the upstairs window, the group finally spotted the old lady, who was sneaking away into the nearby swamp. Joe Duggett later described her appearance as half ghost and half scarecrow, but all witch. The party quickly chased after her, and after a few minutes, they managed to catch up to the maniacal old lady. According to Joe's story, the group found the witch trapped in a patch of quicksand just before her head was about to go under. However, before she was swallowed up, she shouted at the sheriff and his deputies, "I shall return. Everybody always hated me here. I will break out of my grave and burn down the whole town on the morning of the 25th of May, 1904. The men tried to save her, but were too late. By the time they managed to retrieve her body, she had passed away. The following day, she was buried in the middle of the town cemetery. The townsfolk were well aware of what she had said the previous night, and decided to wrap the heaviest chain they could find around her grave. Apparently, the sheriff mockingly said, "If she can break through that, she deserves to burn down Yazoo." As time passed, the witch who threatened the town was soon forgotten. By the 1900s, Yazoo City had hundreds of buildings, and electricity was widespread, with streetlights burning all night. Furthermore, the population continued to grow, now nearing around 6,000 people. The 25th of May 1904 was like any other normal day in the town, yet it would go down in history as one of the greatest catastrophes to hit Yazoo City. A young lady called Pauline Wise was making preparations for her wedding when she discovered a small fire in her living room. It wasn't long until the blaze got out of hand, spreading to neighboring houses. As the winds picked up, the fire expanded to many intersecting streets and even various residential areas. Despite this being a popular theory behind the cause of the fire, there was no conclusive evidence. Other locals believed that the fire had actually started due to a little boy playing with matches, which set a house alight. In any case, the fire started to spread through the whole town, engulfing the whole area in flames. Locals fell into disarray, but swift action from the fire department helped them retreat to safety. Yet, despite the firefighters' best efforts, they couldn't stop the inferno. The result was mass devastation. However, the locals noticed something strange about the fire. Witnesses said that they saw the flames jumping through the air. According to them, it appeared as if a supernatural force was at work. Furthermore, the sudden gust came out of nowhere and was very unusual for that time of day. In the end, the fire destroyed over 3/4 of the town, with more than 200 homes and almost every business having been reduced to ash and rubble. The only buildings that survived were the new courthouse, a library, an unfinished school, a church, and a few residences. Yet, even though Yazoo City was in ruins, fortunately, not a single life was lost. On the morning of the 26th of May, many older residents made their way to the middle of Glenwood Cemetery where the witch had been buried around 20 years before. What they saw confirmed all suspicion. They noticed that the chain around the witch's grave had somehow been broken in two. This had to mean that the fire was the work of the evil old woman who had cursed the town years ago. Following the fire, locals started to rebuild the town, and it took around 2 years for Yazoo City to recover. Although the legend of the Witch of Yazoo was well known in the town, it first became famous in Willie Morris's book, Good Old Boy, published in 1971. Today, tour guides tell the witch's story and show tourists around the Glenwood Cemetery. The Witch of Yazoo's original headstone went missing shortly after being placed and was only engraved with the letters T.W. Some think this is short for the witch, but others believe it refers to her apparent name, Tandy Warren. Present-day law states that when all the chains are gone from the witch's grave, she will return and have her revenge on Yazoo City. To prevent this, the heavy chains that surround the grave are always being repaired. By the early 20th century, belief in the occult was gradually disappearing, but one woman, Britain's last witch, was keeping this alive. Victoria Helen McFarlane, more widely known as Helen Duncan, was born on the 25th of November 1897 in the small town of Callander, Scotland. Her father was Archibald McFarlane, a cabinet maker or slater, and her mother, Isabella Rattray, was a housewife, as was typical of the time. Archibald and Isabella were your ordinary, everyday working people, yet from a young age, Helen's spiritual side was clear. While at school, it was reported that young Helen would behave hysterically and scare other students with her ominous prophecies. Although this didn't really get her into trouble, her mother, Isabella, who was a member of the local Presbyterian church, was not impressed, to say the least. Just like most working-class children, Helen left school around the age of 12. After this, she found work at the Dundee Royal Infirmary. She lived with her parents until she married Henry Duncan in 1916, when she was 20 years old. Her husband was a cabinet maker who had served and been wounded during the First World War. Luckily for Helen, Henry Duncan was supportive of her paranormal talents. Following the marriage, Helen got pregnant a total of 12 times, but as a result of miscarriages and infant deaths, in the end, only 6 out of 12 children survived. To help support the large family, Helen took on a part-time job in a local bleach factory. When she got home, she took care of domestic duties. During this time, she continued to keep in touch with her spiritual abilities and even began to offer seances in order to earn extra cash. Helen was now a physical medium who could conjure up and materialize the spirits of the recently deceased. After years of demonstrating her abilities on a small scale, during the 1930s and 1940s, she began to travel all around Britain with hundreds attending her seances. These sessions took place in all sorts of places, with people from all walks of life, from spiritualists to working folk, and even some academics. During Helen's seances, she would go into a trance state. After this, ectoplasm would come out of her mouth and take on the form of dead loved ones. The recently deceased would be able to touch and communicate with their earthly relatives. This brought great comfort to many grieving families, especially due to the huge loss of life following the First and Second World War. Many testimonies and stories surrounding Helen Duncan's seances exist, yet one that stands out from the rest is from a man named Vincent Woodcock. His wife had died a few weeks prior and decided to go to a demonstration in the company of his sister-in-law. Woodcock recounted that during the seance, Helen Duncan slipped into a trance, and from her mouth a strange spirit began to emerge. It wasn't long until the matter took on the form of his deceased wife, and then she asked them to both stand up. Woodcock's wife then took off her wedding ring, grabbed her younger sister's hand, and slipped it on her finger, saying, "It is my wish that this takes place for the sake of my little girl." Following this, Woodcock married the younger sister of his deceased wife, and a year later, they returned for another session. Again, the dead wife appeared, blessing the couple's marriage and love. Many testimonies like these surrounding Helen Duncan's practices exist. Some of these mention how their lives were changed for the better. However, some people were determined to bring her down and prove that she was a fake medium. In 1928, a photographer named Harvey Metcalf attended various seances at Helen Duncan's house. While there, Harvey quickly took photographs with flash on in order to find out the truth behind the alleged spirits that were materializing. The images he produced supposedly revealed that the spirits were all fake. For example, one was simply a doll made from a painted papier-mâché mask with an old sheet. 3 years later, her practices came to the attention of the London Spiritualist Alliance, who subsequently examined Helen Duncan's method. At this time, it was widely believed by her critics that she regurgitated a cotton cloth in order to create the effect of an ectoplasm. Yet, investigations into this had differing results. Some even suggested that she hid the cloth in her nose, as she was known to have nosebleeds during seances. On one occasion, she was persuaded to swallow a tablet of methylene blue before a seance. This way, any regurgitated object would be blue, thus proving the truth behind the ectoplasm. Nevertheless, accounts varied, with one stating that no ectoplasm appeared. Meanwhile, another claimed that she still produced clean, white ectoplasm. Up until now, it was unclear just how legitimate her practices were. Despite this, people from around the country were still attending her seances. It was around this time that psychic researcher Harry Price paid Duncan £50 to perform a number of test seances with the aim of proving that she was a fraud. In a report, Price wrote this regarding Duncan. At the conclusion of the fourth seance, we led the medium to a settee and called for the apparatus. At the sight of it, the lady promptly went into a trance. She recovered, but refused to be x-rayed. Her husband went up to her and told her it was painless. She jumped up and gave him a smashing blow on the face, which sent him reeling. Then, she went for Dr. William Brown, who was present. He dodged the blow. Mrs. Duncan, without the slightest warning, dashed out into the street, had an attack of hysteria, and began to tear her seance garment to pieces. She clutched the railings and screamed and screamed. Her husband tried to pacify her. It was useless. I leave the reader to visualize the scene. A 17-stone woman, clad in black sateen tights, locked to the railings, screaming at the top of her voice. A crowd collected, and the police arrived. The medical men with us explained the position and prevented them from fetching the ambulance. We got her back into the laboratory, and at once she demanded to be x-rayed. In reply, Dr. William Brown turned to Mr. Duncan and asked him to turn out his pockets. He refused and would not allow us to search him. There is no question that his wife had passed him the cheesecloth in the street. However, they gave us another seance, and the control said we could cut off a piece of teleplasm when it appeared. The sight of half a dozen men, each with a pair of scissors, waiting for the word, was amusing. It came, and we all jumped. One of the doctors got hold of the stuff and secured a piece. The medium screamed, and the rest of the teleplasm went down her throat. This time, it wasn't cheesecloth. It proved to be paper soaked in white of egg and folded into a flattened tube. Could anything be more infantile than a group of grown men wasting time, money, and energy on the antics of a fat female crook? Price also published photographs revealing fake ectoplasm made from cheesecloth, rubber gloves, and cut-out heads from magazine covers, which she claimed were spirits. Furthermore, Duncan's former maid, Mary McGinley, confessed to having aided Duncan in her mediumship tricks, and even Duncan's own husband admitted that the ectoplasm materializations were the result of regurgitation. In spite of this, her seances would continue for years to come. The next issue encountered by Helen Duncan was in 1933, when during a seance, the lights were turned on, revealing the spirit to have been made from a stockinette undervest. Her audience was angered by this. For them, Duncan was a fraud and decided to call the police. Following this, she was prosecuted and convicted of fraudulent mediumship at the Edinburgh Sheriff Court trial. The conviction came with a £10 fine, about £720 today. Nevertheless, her practices continued. When the Second World War broke out, demand for her services greatly increased, with anxious relatives restless to find out the fate of their loved ones or communicate with the ones they had lost. Up until now, authorities hadn't really taken much notice of her, apart from the fine back in 1933. However, in late November 1941, a few days after the sinking of the HMS Barham, Duncan claimed that the spirit of a dead sailor materialized and told her what had occurred. Yet, the interesting thing was that only close relatives of those who had passed away knew the fate of the ship. In order to keep British morale high, the Navy had censored the sinking and warned those informed to not discuss the information with anyone. So, as the Navy believed there was no way Duncan could have known, they started to take interest in her activities. In January 1944, Duncan held a séance in a private house in Portsmouth. 2 lieutenants from the Navy attended, yet they were not impressed. In fact, they were offended by her fraudulence. Lieutenant Worth recalled how a white cloth figure appeared behind the curtains, claiming to be his deceased aunt. However, his aunt was alive and well. The same thing happened later on, this time claiming to be his sister, but she was also alive. Worth, disgusted by this, reported Duncan and her accomplices to the police. A few days later, on the 19th of January, undercover policemen launched a sudden raid on her place of work. Worth was amongst those present, and he even tried to grab the ectoplasm, which he believed was a white sheet. But it dematerialized too quickly. A search of the premises led to no white sheets being found, making some wonder if it was a real spirit or how she pulled it off. As a result of the raid, Helen Duncan was arrested and taken before Portsmouth magistrates, where she was charged with vagrancy. Yet, this was a minor crime, with the maximum fine being just 5 shillings, with no further punishment. However, it seemed as though authorities were intent on giving her a larger sentence, as they refused her bail. Instead, she was moved to a notorious women's prison in London called Holloway. It was known for holding Victorian murderers and traitors, most of whom were destined to be hanged. Having Duncan in jail gave authorities more time to determine the best charge to bring against her. First, they decided to change the vagrancy charge for conspiracy, which at the time could lead to a death sentence. However, this was later changed when the case was referred to the Old Bailey. The charge was amended to witchcraft. Under an ancient act from 1735, Helen Duncan was accused of pretending to exercise or use human conjuration that through the agency of Helen Duncan's spirits of deceased dead persons should appear to be present. This attitude towards Duncan by the prosecution might have been due to the rough situation in which the country found itself, but also as the establishment was paranoid and afraid that she would reveal other classified information, such as that concerning D-Day. The trial of Helen Duncan for fraudulent witchcraft caused widespread attention and controversy around the country. The trial was complicated for the prosecution due to the lack of physical evidence. Instead, witnesses were called to the stand one by one. Of course, some claimed that she was a fraud. Meanwhile, others were convinced that she was an authentic medium with legitimate powers. During the trial, Duncan even attempted to demonstrate her abilities in front of the jury to prove that she was no fraud. Yet, the judge didn't allow this. After 30 minutes deliberation, the jury returned with a guilty verdict for contravening the 1735 Witchcraft Act, but was acquitted on all other charges. As a result, Duncan was sentenced to 9 months imprisonment. Upon hearing her sentence, she cried out, "I have done nothing. Is there a God?" Helen Duncan was one of the last people convicted under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. This, along with just how famous the case was at the time, led to her being referred to by many as Britain's last witch. The Prime Minister at the time, Winston Churchill, criticised the whole proceeding as a waste of time and a misuse of court resources. In a memo to the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, he stated that the charge was obsolete tomfoolery. After an appeal to the House of Lords, which was denied, Duncan was sent back to the infamous Holloway prison. Up and down the country, her supporters believed that the sentence was a total injustice. Apparently, her prison wardens felt the same, and it's been claimed that they decided against locking her cell door, always leaving it open. In 1951, the Witchcraft Act was repealed and became integrated in the Fraudulent Mediums Act. Helen Duncan's trial was a contributing factor to this change. After Duncan completed her sentence, she apparently promised to stop conducting seances. However, it's clear that there were no meaning behind her words. 11 years later, in 1956, another raid occurred while she was in the middle of a seance. Again, she was arrested. Helen died on the 6th of December 1956, aged 59, in her home in Edinburgh, due to ill health, likely due to her obesity and heart problems. However, certain spiritualists claim that her death was a direct result of the police raid in November 1956. Helen Duncan was in a trance state at the moment of the raid. While in this state, nobody can touch you. As if they do, the ectoplasm can return too quickly to the medium's body, causing serious damage. Of course, the police were ignorant of this, and apparently, as a result, Duncan was left with 2 second-degree burns on her stomach. She is said to have spent time in hospital and then rested at home. She died just 5 weeks after the police raid. Thank you so much everyone for watching these chilling witch stories. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the stories down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also be sure to let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.